Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to talk about some of the model development, model evaluation, and model application we've been doing in our lab the last couple of years, few years. So first of all, I just want to say that I'm going to limit the scope of what I'm talking about to really radiative effects and effects on air temperature. Okay, so I'm not going to. There's all kinds of other impacts that trees have that are very important on the wind environment, air quality. We've heard about some of these, and I'm going to ignore those for now, but obviously a more holistic take on trees, we need to focus on those. And ultimately, a question I've been thinking about a lot is how do we maximize the cooling per street tree? So a kind of an efficiency. And so the two outcomes I'm going to focus on today are air temperature and mean radiant temperature. And of course, we want to think about, in terms of those outcomes, what are we, what kind of canopy cover do we need? What kind of spatial arrangements of the trees? What kind of species? What kind of tree size and shape, et cetera? And really what we're trying to do in my group is get at the process-based linkages through numerical modeling that link these two. And just a note on scale as I transition, obviously the impacts of trees are very different in terms of their scale on air temperature and mean radiant temperature. So if we think about street scale or pedestrian scale impacts on mean radiant temperature, I have two pedestrians here just for illustration purposes. Obviously, under the trees, we have the shading impact, the increase in, nicely illustrated by the last presentation, the increase in long wave radiation, and we don't have those under the trees. And then, of course, the ground is a different temperature, and we have different reflected impacts, right? So we have reflection off the trees at the pedestrian that might be near trees, but not under the trees being shaded. We have reflection off the surface, the ground surface. And then what we're finding is a reasonably important factor, and many others have found this as well, is that the long wave emission from the hot surface is quite significant compared to the long wave emission from a shaded surface under trees. And so the models we've been developing at the microscale, or the model we've been developing at the microscale, captures all of these factors. And then at the neighborhood scale, this is more the BEP tree model that Sebastian mentioned. We're trying to capture at the block or neighborhood scale the impact of trees on air temperature. And of course, there's multiple processes that either directly or indirectly impact air temperature. So obviously shade, right? So we're shifting where the radiation is being absorbed, that increase in long wave, the slowing of the wind, reduced ventilation, and then shift the energy we are intercepting. That's no longer fully going into sensible heat as long as the trees are able to transpire and instead to latent heat. So these are the two models we've been working with, BEP tree and tough pedestrian. On the right, what you're seeing is the impacts on surface temperature on the gray infrastructure of street tree planting in the buildings, essentially. So this is over the course of one day. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're not necessarily trying to capture the exact built form of a neighborhood, but we're running more idealized experiments trying to understand the impacts of trees on pedestrians, for example. On the left, BEP tree, we're working in the framework of an urban canopy model or a canyon model that is meant to go in a mesoscale model. And we've added layers of trees where we have different leaf area densities at different levels, and we're capturing all the effects I just talked about with these tree layers. So let's drill down a little bit into the street scale, some of the work we've done, and the pedestrian scale. So first, we have compared our tough pedestrian model against MARDI measurements. And these are some measurements at Arizona State University. And essentially, so here's, over the course of the day, the diurnal progression of mean radiant temperature, both in a shaded under trees and then not under trees in the same canyon. And you can see the model compares reasonably well. The disagreement in the afternoon there is actually not a physics-based disagreement. It's actually, we couldn't, in the model, fully capture the geometry exactly. And we can also drill down and look at the long wave and short wave fluxes from different directions, okay, which MARDI also captures. And so here's, for example, on the south side of the pedestrian, the long wave incident, or absorbed rather, on the south side of the pedestrian. We can see that the model is actually capturing the directional aspects that compose the mean radiant temperature fairly well. And so what we've done is we've done some experiments where we plant anywhere from no trees, increasing tree numbers with a regular distance between them, all the way up to the whole sidewalk covered with street trees. And we can come up with plots like this, where these are essentially the radiated fluxes that compose mean radiant temperature. And what we're looking at here is the blues and greens are the long wave components of the long wave fluxes from different directions on the pedestrian, and the red and pink are the shortwave fluxes from different directions. And you can see as we go from the no tree case all the way down to the 100% sidewalk street tree coverage case, we see the large reduction as expected in the shortwave and a small reduction in the long wave. We can actually take the differences. So here we have at the top the 25% of the sidewalk covered in street trees all the way down to 100% at the bottom. And you can see again that large decrease due to shortwave reduction on the pedestrian, but also we find that the actual cooling due to the shading of the streets, the reduction of the surface temperature, and therefore less long wave emission to the pedestrian can be up to 25%. It's not always that high, but especially during the middle of the day. So that's a significant piece. And with our model, we're capturing the spatial distribution, the detailed spatial distribution of the surface temperature, and therefore the detailed long wave emission on the pedestrian. We've done one more experiment with this model where we essentially looked for a variety of cases. Here's one of them. And we're looking at, as we increase the sidewalk street tree fraction on the x-axis, okay, so we go from the trees are quite spaced apart to there's no more space to plant any more trees, essentially on the right. And what is the reduction in the mean radiant temperature? We find a small nonlinearity. So it was actually a small reduction in efficiency of radiative cooling effectiveness per street tree. And we think this is mutual shading between trees. And we think there's probably some critical, depending on a variety of factors, some critical point where you start to get that mutual shading, and therefore you start to get a reduced effectiveness per street tree. And you saw Jan's presentation a couple presentations back, and we're looking at this a little more detail with the POM4U model, where we can additionally, tough pedestrian doesn't do flow modeling, so now we can additionally account for the wind field and air quality implications and humidity, et cetera. Okay, so let's move on to the neighborhood scale, block to neighborhood scale, where we've been developing the BEP tree model, and we're now combining it with the WRF model, or adding it into the WRF model rather. And so here we're really looking at impacts on air temperature rather than mean radiant temperature. So just briefly, the BEP tree model is a multi-layer canyon-based model. And because it's multi-layer, we capture multiple layers of the atmosphere within the canyon, so we can capture the pedestrian level. And we're accounting for the spatial distribution of trees, not specifically where are they, but are they clumped together or are they evenly spread apart in the physics. And we're capturing all of those processes I mentioned earlier, right? So the interception of solar radiation, like leaf energy balance, transpiration, long wave and shelter or drag. And so really the first two are typically cooling mechanisms of trees, and the latter two are typically warming mechanisms. And we've run some simple experiments offline where we essentially do the same thing. We increase the tree cover in the canyon. And what we find is actually the opposite. We get a slight increase in cooling efficiency per street tree as we increase the tree fraction, at least during the day. And so why this nonlinearity? Well, it really depends on physics. This is a model, right? Everything in the model we've added. So it really depends on the physics we've added. And my suspicion is that it's one of two things. One is the first few trees you add cause a lot more drag than the last few trees you add once there's already a number of trees. Or secondly, the leaves have a much higher absorptivity in the long wave than the short wave. So the warming long wave effect sort of saturates faster than the impact of shading. You need more leaves to fully saturate the shading effect. So yeah, importantly, basically, any linearities or non-linearities we find come from our representation of the physical and physiological processes in the model. So we need to be really careful how we code those in. And the way we've been approaching this in the last few years is using microscale models, high fidelity microscale models to develop our neighborhood scale parameterization. So working, for example, with Brian Bailey at UC Davis with his Helios model, and looking at essentially how tree crowns are organized or like distributed spatially in the horizontal. How does that affect the effective amount of radiation that passes through those tree crowns to ground level? So this informs our crown scale clumping relations in BEP tree. We've also been working with Negan Nazarian and Alberto Martilli on flow modeling, RJ simulation, which in terms of developing the vertical turbulent transfer within the multi-layer canopy model. This has been quite challenging work, but we've made it pretty far. And really what we're doing now with the model is implementing it in WRF BEM. And so BEM, as you know, is the multi-layer scheme in WRF. Picture here has now got the building energy model, of course, for many years in buildings. And really what we're doing is we're adding BEP tree into that. So we have trees fully interactive in the canyon. And the coupling is essentially complete. We've somewhat simplified one process, but otherwise it's complete. We need to keep doing some testing. I'm going to show you some of the model evaluation we've done so far, basically on the results that Austin just presented. So these are from, Jamie Voot at Western. Essentially what we're looking at here is the flux is on the road surface of like spatially averaged of shortwave and long wave in a tree covered neighborhood. And we can see we're capturing the shortwave and the long wave reasonably well. When we look at the differences relative to the low tree case, okay, so here we're comparing a high tree case and essentially a no tree case or sparsely treed case. We can see we're doing okay, but we're actually missing a little bit of the signal from the trees, at least in the shortwave. I think probably one of the assumptions that we've corrected in the offline version we need to add in here is that we're currently assuming that leaves are essentially reflecting and transmitting equally, but they're better at reflecting generally. That's probably part of this, if not all of it, this difference. So we're going to keep working and testing at the model, but we're getting close with the full coupling. So a few closing remarks. And again, I want to just be careful to contextualize that I've only looked at air temperature and mean radiant temperature here. So if we actually added in, an evaluation of wind and humidity and air quality, these may not hold. But in general, in terms of air temperature, it seems like more trees, the better. In terms of the efficiency of the trees, not just more trees, the better, but the effectiveness of an individual tree. And in terms of mean radiant temperature reduction, I want to think a little bit about not putting them. If we put them too close together, they may reduce each other's effectiveness somewhat. The WRF BEP tree in WRF, the coupling is nearing completion, and the model evaluation is pretty promising so far, but there's a bit more work to do. And I just want to, if you're interested in either of these two models or their combination, my PhD student tomorrow morning will be presenting essentially using both of them to assess the impacts of street trees as well as many other adaptation strategies on multiple outcomes, including outdoor thermal stress, base cooling, dispersion under future climates. And many people have contributed to this over the years, and I think I'm missing some names, but here are a few of them. So thanks very much.
Question for Scott. There's one. That was a quick one.
Same one. Again, thanks for the presentation. What I understood from your presentation, you measured temperature along pure rock, isn't it? Covered with trees. Then did you find any difference between the beginning and at the end of the road? There was any profile in there, and how the ambient conditions can affect your results, like winds and so on.
Yeah, so in terms of the first part of your question, the first microscale model I showed has no flow component, no horizontal flow component. It's essentially, it's a very simple model on the flow side. So I agree that those accumulations would happen, and we're not capturing that. The other model we were looking at, the BEP tree, we're essentially capturing, a neighborhood or block average, and so the horizontal transport is between the different grid cells, right? So.
That answers your question.
It's fine. You can catch up.
Yeah.
Catch up.
Okay.
All right. In sake of time, let's thanks Scott again. Next up, and I hope I pronounce your last name correct, we have Dominique Derome.